Buongiorno o buonasera a seconda dell'ora a cui ci ascoltate, benvenuti su Liberi Oltre. Siamo qui con Iryna Matviyishyn, che è una giornalista di Ucraina del Kyiv Independent. Alcuni di voi si ricorderanno Iryna perché era stata penso la nostra prima ospite ucraina nel primo mese dell'invasione russa dell'Ucraina circa quasi un anno fa. Quindi siamo particolarmente contenti di averla nostra ospite di nuovo. Questa volta, oltre ovviamente a chiederle della sua esperienza come giornalista in Ucraina durante questi mesi, parleremo di un argomento abbastanza specifico che è il reporting sui crimini di guerra commessi dall'esercito russo, dalle forze armate russe durante l'occupazione dell'Ucraina e durante l'invasione, ovviamente. Iryna, thank you so much for being with us. We're really glad to have you as a guest again.
Thank you so much for inviting me again. It's been a few months since then, so it will be interesting to talk again.
Yeah, it's almost a year, which is telling. And precisely because of that, of course, as I said in the introduction, we're going to speak, at length about the war crimes and human rights violations that have been committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask you more about your work as a journalist of the past year. Of course, you're working for Kyiv Independent now, and what does your current role as a video reporter involve? And in general,
Yeah.
how has it been to be a journalist in Ukraine over the past 11 months?
So right now I work as a video reporter at the Kyiv Independent. I joined the team in September. It was very unexpected because I planned to take a break. I was super tired from my work with NPR, like a local producer. And I wanted to try some freelancing, but with all the events that are happening, it was difficult to even take some rest. So in September, my friend just asked me to join the video department, and that's how I started working there. I started from doing reportage stories on war crimes, and I went to Chernihiv Oblast, the liberated area, when it was not like on the media anymore, because several months passed since it was liberated. But when I went there just like to see everything for myself one more time, because I went first time during the press tour, and it was very hectic, and I found it like a bit useless in terms of reporting. And I decided to go by myself to the surrounding villages to check what was happening. And it was already September, as I said, a few months after the liberation, but all consequences of the Russian occupation and the beginning of the invasion were still very visible. And for people there, like, even though it's passed on the news agenda, for people there, the problems remained almost the same. They had their houses destroyed. They could not find their neighbors or relatives. So I made a story about a farm that was destroyed by the Russians, where a lot of people were hiding, a lot of territorial defense. That was my first piece. And later, I started to do more like analytical videos on camera about Russian propaganda, about attacks on civilian infrastructure, how Russia twists the terminology to say that they are like to present themselves as rescuers, but in fact, like, they were deporting people from occupied territories. And like it involved like both reportage and analysis. Later, I went to liberated Kherson region. I spent 1 week there after the liberation and was documenting war crimes as well. Also talking to locals about the humanitarian situation, and it was like it was a very contradicting atmosphere, because there was still a lot of joy on the second week since the liberation. You could feel it, that people were happy to be back in Ukraine. But at the same time, almost like every second person I talked to had some kind of bad occupation story to tell. Either it was Russian captivity, like I met two guys just in a cafe who told me that they spent like either a few months or a few days in Russian captivity being tortured. Or like accidentally I met a woman whose daughter and her grandchild was deported to Russia, and she didn't know what was happening to them because she lost connection, and Russians promised that they would take them to the retreat somewhere in I don't remember the town, the city. I will not say, but it was somewhere far in Russia, and they promised them to take them back in a few weeks, but they didn't go back, and this poor woman, she lost contact with them. So there was a lot of work, like it was emotionally very hard, and yeah, it's amazing how like the scale of everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine is so huge that even though we have so many journalists working on the ground, you can always find a new story to cover, and every story deserves attention because it's something like grave that you have to document to hold Russia accountable in the future. I documented a war crime in Chernobyevka also accidentally when I talked to a local who was waiting for humanitarian aid. I asked him what was happening, and he told me that two young men were killed in the village, and I asked him to take me to the house of their family, to their families. So we talked to the father, we talked to the grandma of another man, and it turned out that nobody yet documented these crimes. So I was the first one to them. So there was a lot of work, and sometimes I felt overwhelmed. That I wanted to do more, but just like one person trying to cover what I can. And like since the new year, I would be more focused on video analysis. We will do more video explainers on important topics. We'll try to monitor Russian propaganda more, but also to explain Ukrainian history as well, to explain modern processes that sometimes stay away from media attention. So yeah, this is my work that involves a lot of things.
And thank you for that. And of course, I think it's very important sometimes to underline, the experience of Ukrainian journalists, to whom we all ought to be very grateful for their work. I mean, we get a lot of news from American, British, Italian, whatever correspondents in Ukraine, and many of them do an amazing job. But it's the difference is that they're foreign correspondents. They have somewhere to go back to when they're done. Whereas the different experience, of course, of being a Ukrainian journalist is that you're in it all the time. Like you have nowhere else to go, really.
Yeah, and I feel actually I appreciate the work of all foreign correspondents, and sometimes I'm amazed by how consistent they are in like going to all these liberated territories, covering all this. But at the same time, I understand that the level of compassion might be different, and we live through all the stories, like especially like if you are a Ukrainian, you perceive it on a different level, and it's just like emotionally difficult. I was doing like a video about Dnipro when it happened, and I was already very exhausted emotionally because Dnipro attack happened on Saturday, and on Saturday I learned that my brother was going to the front line, and on the same day there were a few air raid sirens in Kyiv, and I basically spent my day in the bathroom. And I was very worried for my brother. I was anxious because of the attacks, because there were too many in the same day. And then Dnipro happened, and like this day just killed me. And like over Sunday, I tried to recover, but on Monday I had to go to work. So I started to do this reel about the victims of Russian attack on the residential building in Dnipro, and I was reading stories of these people. And I tried to like detach myself from what I'm doing emotionally. But in the end of the day, like I felt okay. And in the end of the day, I just fainted in the office. And I understood that it was just too much of everything. And sometimes we don't even, we try to act like it's normal and we get used to it, of course. But I think just because we know that we are very close to the people that were killed, and like we it could have been us, like being on the place of the victims, we have a different level of sympathy, compassion, and sometimes it's just like exhausts you emotionally. And I'm very grateful to all foreign journalists who keep coming to Ukraine to do this work. And I'm also stunned by some of my Ukrainian colleagues that keep doing it like for months, documenting war crimes nonstop, like talking to victims of war. I think it's a very emotionally demanding job, and I can't do it nonstop. Like that's why I have analytical work, and I do something like more vague, not to be constantly in this emotional drain, even though life in Ukraine is also an emotional drain. Yeah, so it's different for us and for foreigners, I think.
Yes, of course, it's entirely different also because it's not just yourself, it's everyone you know and everything you know, like your own home and your own family and your own friend, they're all in the same situation. So it's an entirely different experience. And of course, I imagine, the understanding also what's happening, it's more nuanced, and you will spot and see things that as an outsider, no matter how much you know about the region, no matter how experienced you are, you would simply not, you would simply miss. And as I mentioned in the beginning of our interview, your background is actually in human rights studies. And one of the things that we wanted to explore in this interview is the scope and extent of the war crimes and human rights violations that have been perpetrated by the Russian forces in Ukraine. It is a very difficult subject to discuss, for many reasons, but I also find that one of the things that is not always easy to deal with is, on one hand, there is a huge amount of material, to the extent that sometimes people, the shock of, the shock of those very first pictures from Bucha, right, kind of gets lost with time. Like people are getting slightly more used to it. Used to it is not the right word, but you'll understand what I mean. Like people are, that level of shock is doesn't happen every time now that something similar is discovered. Yeah. At the same time, there is so much coming through that it's almost hard, it's very hard to grasp the reality of it, like how extensive, how systemic these crimes are. So one of the first things I wanted to ask you is to try and give us like a sense of the full extent and scope and variety of crimes that have been committed in Ukraine by the Russian forces.
Yeah, I mean, I have a background in human rights. It was my master's degree, but my studies didn't prepare me for this war. I mean, nothing, I think, can prepare you for what is happening. And the scale is really terrifying. I just checked like the recent update from the office of the General Prosecutor's Office, and the last number so far is almost 68,000 war crimes documented at this point in Ukraine, which is like even hard to comprehend. It's only what is documented, and it's growing every second day, and we can only imagine how many of them would be investigated, because with this number of war crimes, it's really like too much for any state to investigate, even with the help of international prosecutors. And that's what is alarming, and what all other human rights defenders are talking about, that Ukraine doesn't have the capacity of investigating so many war crimes, even if it takes all the prosecutors, all the investigators from different kinds of departments, those who take care of ordinary crimes. It will not be enough, and Ukraine has to change its laws to allow international prosecutors to do this kind of work to help us deal with all these war crimes. But civil society is doing also amazing job by investigating perpetrators of these war crimes, tracking Russians who were committing these crimes in different areas of Ukraine. We have a lot of journalists taking care of it too, and I see it from time to time, and I think at this point, like, this scale of war crimes also motivates Ukrainians to be involved, not to allow us to forget and to let it go, even though we realize like the capacity is not that strong to investigate all this on the state level. People demand justice, and they will do everything to have justice for at least half of those victims. It's still like scary. Of course, we saw a lot of these pictures, not only from Bucha but from Mariupol, like dead people on the streets. We saw children without limbs, soldiers with terrifying wounds that might never have a normal life anymore. It's just like the amount of trauma from seeing all this, like, I don't know, maybe in several years we will feel all the consequences, but right now we are kind of like getting adapted to it. But it's also hard to say that we are used to it, because you can't be used to this level of cruelty. I still can't watch like videos of soldiers like being evacuated when they're wounded at the front line, because like the severity of these injuries is something that I haven't seen anywhere, because it's a lot of different munitions that causes very like terrifying injuries. It's not like just losing a limb or just getting a bullet in your body, but there are some terrible things that we see on social media. And I think even people like in Western Ukraine, like a lot of Ukrainians say that, oh, like, but you're in the West, you're safe. Why are you complaining? But I think everything that we see on the social media, and it's also our bubble, it's not the bubble of not of all Western people who are following Ukraine, even, because we see a lot of content that doesn't reach out to the world. A lot of these videos cause vicarious trauma, and that was something I remembered from my human rights courses. We had like one class with a man who was working with Amnesty for digital verification, and he told us that a lot of human rights defenders get treatment because of vicarious trauma when they see traumatizing videos. And when I remember this, like I just think about like that all of us would have to go through some kind of therapy after all that we see on social media, because it's not normal. And what the world sees like about Bucha, Mariupol, it's just like a part of the story. And in fact, like things that were happening in Kherson Oblast or in still occupied territories like Berdyansk or in the other territories in the south or east, are not better. And in Kherson Oblast, there were so many stories when people were missing, when people were found, like people are still being found in the ground, like in some amateur graves, mass graves, or something like this. It's still ongoing, and it doesn't drag so much attention because everyone already saw it. But we still see this news from day to day. And it's terrible to imagine like what is the real number of these war crimes. What will we see when the war ends and when all the territories are deoccupied? It's just like I don't even want to think about it. So yeah, that's our life now.
Yes, and since you mentioned her son, actually, I have to say that I'm quite, negatively impressed by how, in a way, so much attention has been dedicated in the media to the liberation of her son, and rightly so. I mean, it was obviously a pivotal and really important moment, but we haven't seen. Of course, the situation is different in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine, has been very little reporting about what's being found in liberated Kherson. Like nothing's like it's not comparable to the amount of coverage that places like Izium and Bucha got. And don't get me wrong, I don't want, it's also wrong to pit places against each other. It's not about that, but it's true there has been consistently less coverage on Kherson, on liberated Kherson. And I was wondering, since you've been there yourself, what are, like, if you could tell us more about what you've seen and the examples of war crimes that could be found there.
Well, when I arrived to Kherson, it was like the second week since the liberation, and like visually everything seemed fine. I mean, of course, like streets were full of people in the city center, not so much in the outskirts. There were some damaged buildings here and there, but the city center was predominantly fine, and everyone was very joyful because of the liberation. But at the same time, the first weeks showed how people, in what kind of conditions people lived, because everyone came to the city center also to get humanitarian aid. And people were sometimes, like, it was disorganized, so people were just fighting for food. And a lot of Ukrainian journalists were writing about it. They complained on the local government that this process was not organized, why people have to fight for food. People were very angry. I think like in any kind of similar situation, people would think for themselves first after what they endured. But it showed, to me, it showed that they were like surviving on basic instincts, and it showed that Russian occupation was not a life that they wanted or anyone would want, because there was a shortage of products. They didn't deliver a humanitarian aid, like they didn't help volunteers who were delivering humanitarian aid or who were risking their lives to help civilians. They were only doing it for on camera when it was like needed for the propaganda, and that was it. Most of the residents were without medicine. There was no medicine in Kherson, like since the beginning of occupation, when everything was taken. There was no delivery of medical treatment. So I know about cases when people died because they couldn't get treatment. A lot of doctors evacuated. Some of the doctors were just like afraid to go out because it was like if you were a pro-Ukrainian, you were risking to end up in a cell, which a lot of people did. A lot of people told me in Kherson that it was the first time for them in months to go out. They tried to stay inside and not to show up on the street because they knew that they could be like questioned and also taken to the captivity, to one of the detention centers where people were held for months and where people were tortured and some died. And I saw like joy on people's faces because they said, we are ready to live without connection and light for a bit more if we have to, but it's better to be without connection and electricity, but to live on a free territory. And they didn't have, like when the liberation happened, they didn't have electricity or power, like water or even connection, mobile connection. A lot of people came to the city center where Starlinks were set up to call their relatives and to contact their families for the first time in months. And I saw people crying, like calling to their families, telling them that they are okay. So it was really heartbreaking. And if Kherson was fine, speaking like of buildings, like the damage by artillery or missiles at that time, neighboring villages, like even the first village when you leave Kherson, Chernobyevka, they had like very visible consequences of war, and they were literally caught in crossfire, and a lot of buildings were destroyed. And when I was in Chernobyevka doing stories, I heard like explosions every now and then, and I did not differentiate where was the incoming or outcoming, and I was like always like on alert, and sometimes it was too close, so I was literally shaking. But the civilians said, "Oh no, it's nothing compared to what we lived through," and they didn't even blink when it happened. Only when something flew very close, they would like fall near the fence or sit down near some like wall. But in general, it was like a normal life for them, so they wouldn't even pay attention. Like I went to the airport that was destroyed completely, and because of this airport, civilians were also suffering from Russian occupation, like from Russians directly. They were scared to go out. Some of them lost children, as I said. I documented the story, or some people went missing, but also they were suffering from all the fights that were ongoing. And now, like after a few weeks since the liberation, Kherson became a target of Russian troops. They started to take revenge, in brackets, on civilians, and they are just like launching missiles and artillery on everything they can. There's no logic, just like destroying the city, killing people living there. So yeah, I mean, it got attention for a reason, because I think we had a lot of information from Kherson, maybe even more than about Mariupol, since a lot of Ukrainians stayed there, and they kept they hoped for the liberation, and they waited for the liberation, and they were giving away information to Ukrainian troops and to Ukrainian human rights defenders about all the violations that were happening. So everyone knew the importance of liberating Kherson.
And in that sense, I think what you did was also like explaining how the variety of war crimes. I mean, of course, we when we speak of war crimes, we speak about like indiscriminate attacks against civilian targets, and of course, we've seen the examples of ill treatment and torture and willful killing of civilians. But of course, there is much more to that, which is abductions, kidnappings, widespread sexual violence, and deportations. And I think the one about deportation is one of the subjects that is hardest to discuss, also because it's about reporting about something which is not there anymore. Like you can't, it's not as easy as with other things. But we have, the numbers, the provisional numbers that are reported are about more than 1 million people have been deported by the Russian forces, among which hundreds of thousands of children. And sometimes in some Western media, you still hear about evacuation, which is simply infuriating. And yeah, I wanted to ask you if you could tell us more about deportations, because I feel it's one of the subjects that has been least explored and not discussed enough in the West.
Yeah. We've been talking about it with my colleagues too. One of my colleagues was trying to make a story for the website, and it takes a lot of time to investigate these kind of things, because, as you've said, people are not there anymore, and a lot of people don't have much details since they were afraid to go out, or they were afraid of Russians to notice them. But when I was in Kherson, I met this woman accidentally that I told you about. I met her talking to the police. She was crying and talking to the police in the underground passing, and I just stood by to listen what she was saying. And it turned out that her child and granddaughter were deported, and she hadn't heard from them for several months. And when I asked her, like in details, like where they were the last time, like where they were taken from, why they were taken, like how Russians justified like taking them away from their city, and she said that her grandchild studied in a school wherein Russians promised like children to take them for vacation. And they asked parents children who had parents, they asked the parents if they wanted to go for a retreat for several weeks, just like to be safe and to take some rest, and then they would take them back. And this woman told me that they persuaded her daughter. She asked her daughter not to go because she was like suspicious about it, and she said that it might be dangerous. But the daughter decided to take a child, maybe because there were crossfires, the counterattacks were ongoing, and she was afraid. So they left by buses from the school, and I went close to the school, and then I saw a man walking by. I asked him by accident. It sounds weird, but there was the only man on the street, and I asked him whether he knows anything about children being taken from that school. And he said he saw, when he was going to work one morning, he saw buses with children escorted by military. And he doesn't know much, but that's what he saw. And there are reports that children were taken from schools, from orphanages, and they were promised some kind of vacation or camps in Russia. But we don't know much what's happening there. And also that's a problem for the human rights defenders, because since the civil society is terrorized by the Russian government and it basically doesn't exist anymore, since even human rights defenders have no access to a lot of things, and they're also risking their lives to document anything. It's very difficult for Ukrainian or international human rights defenders to track these children, to know what's going on with them. There are reports here and there that you can find in Russian propaganda medium. That's one of the ways to to get a glimpse of what is happening to Ukrainians who were taken either to Russian captivity or to some kind of camps, because Russian propaganda often makes reports to show forcing these people to speak against Ukraine and to show that Russia is taking care of them, to show that they care for refugees. And in these reports, sometimes you can find out where certain person from Ukraine is, what's happening to this person. And we wanted to do this investigation with my colleagues about it. But I think since we know that it's very complicated, it might take several months. And that's also the reason why not so many journalists are doing it. It demands a lot of time and effort. I saw one documentary also occasionally on the French media Arte, which was about refugees from Mariupol taken out to Russia, and they were kept in some kind of camps, and they were not allowed to get out. And some Russian volunteers were helping them also on their own risk, because it was not allowed to help if you were not a state volunteer. And eventually these volunteers managed to evacuate several families. But as I understood, this was mostly like a lucky case. It's not like all refugees are so lucky to meet these kind of courageous volunteers that want to help them to leave Russia. Mostly these people are being held in closed facilities, and they are watched by Russian authorities. Children are often militarized. That's one of the tricks why Russia evacuated so many children, because with their demographic situation, they also know that they would have to have the future generation that would of Ukrainians also that would hate Ukraine and would be more prone to being militarized and things like this. And we see this militarization camps and education that switches the mindset of these people and makes them hostile towards Ukraine. And we saw this on occupied territories as well, in Crimea, in occupied Donbass, even before the full-scale invasion. There was a full-scale militarization of children, and maybe this generation is already fighting on the Russian side. That's actually the goal of such things.
Yes, and just for our listeners, just to clarify a few things, when you were referencing camps, we're talking about, on one hand, the filtration camps in Russian occupied territories in Ukraine, where people who are being deported are stationed for undefined period of time, very often obviously in terrible conditions, and very often being tortured or victims of other forms of ill treatments. There are examples of re-educations and so on. And then from there, they are deported into Russia proper. And I think that's where I feel there is a bit less of an understanding of what happens there. So if I understand correctly, a lot of people are kept in camps there too. But also we see a lot of, or we read about Ukrainian children that have been deported, then been given for adoptions to Russian families, which it's one of the definitions of genocide, incidentally. It's one of the definition of genocide is to forcefully transfer children from one group to another. I think this is important for everyone who listens to us to understand. So when we say that, Russia's war in Ukraine is a genocidal war, it's not just in its intention, it's in the practice that are being displayed.
I mean, that's why we call it a genocide, but so many people say that it's just words, that there's no confirmation. But if you look at the definition of genocide and what it implies, Russia basically puts all the ticks to each component of what genocide means. And these children who are adopted, like, let's start from the beginning, like displacing people on the occupied territories is already not allowed by the international law. But putting them into families of another country by force is already like something of the next level. And of course, these families would not be pro-Ukrainian, or would not be families who have some kind of critical mind towards Russia. As we saw, like the recent video when the Russian couple was detained in a restaurant for talking about Ukraine, and someone snitched on them, and the police came and detained them for supporting Ukraine. And how can we assume that these children would end up in normal families? There's no chance. Like, of course they would be taken to the families that Russian state knows that they would take care of their ideological views, and they would impose their views on these children. And it's very sad because there's no way to take them out for now, like, since Russia is inaccessible. It's under no rule of international law de facto, and it's hard to imagine what would happen to these kids. And I heard about cases when relatives of these kids are trying to find legal ways to get them out, but knowing that rule of law does not apply there, and that international community also has very little influence on what is happening there, it's difficult to assume that they can just like leave these families or be taken out. I don't know, like, it's a very sad topic, and I don't even know what to say about it. But there was good news recently that 16 kids were brought back from Russia. They were deported from Kherson region, and they were brought back to Ukraine by the efforts of human rights defenders too. So there is hope, but we imagine that it's only 16 kids out of thousands that are there. And how do we take them out? That's a question. To me, it's very heartbreaking to realize that the international law does not work, and the international community doesn't really have a mechanism to fight these kind of massive war crimes and acts of genocide, after so many examples in the world, like throughout history. I went to Sarajevo in October, and I went to these museums of genocide, and when I was there, I had like constant flashback, and it broke my heart to realize that what I saw there was happening in my country, and nothing changes. Like, I mean, of course, media talk more, and politicians, world leaders take an active stance, but like, people keep being killed, people keep being deported, tortured and abducted, and there's no real mechanism to stop it. And I think that's like, Ukraine should be like a wake-up call for all these institutions to finally recharge and restructure all of their policies on preventing and countering genocide, preventing like war crimes of such scale.
And since you mentioned the media, I think I'll go back to something that we were discussing before the beginning of the interview, which is how is this being portrayed in the media and how this ties with propaganda, with the Russian propaganda on the subject. I think one of the first things that I would notice is that on one hand, it's quite extraordinary how the Russian narrative about this war is openly genocidal. It's almost not making a mystery out of it. It's not trying to conceal its genocidal intentions, which is quite, I mean, I don't want to use the word unusual, but it's quite startling the way in which this is very much in the open. And at the same time, however, it's spreading this, and that's more directed to like a domestic audience, and then on the kind of international audience, is trying to spread forms of misinformation that basically try to undermine Western sympathy for Ukrainians. How would you say that these two things ties together with everything we've been discussing about so far?
Yeah, well, that's my daily struggle of monitoring Western Twitter about Ukraine. I see more and more of these people, like experts in brackets, who pop up out of the blue and start speaking about Ukraine, calling for peace or stopping the war. And it's a mystery for me, like why these people start speaking about Ukraine. What is their goal? Like, if they were not interested, why don't you stick to your expertise? Another aspect is that many of them, I'm sure, are on the Kremlin's payroll, because since Russia is losing on a battlefield, and we know that they've been talking about peace talks, peace agreements for a long time, because they can't even take towns like Bakhmut. They start to resort to Western useful idiots, we call them, to use them as mouthpiece to call the rest of the world for peace and say that, look, we can save so many lives just by reaching an agreement and by giving up fighting, not sending weapons. Like, the whole pacifist narrative is basically pro-Russian, because it misses one point, that Ukraine did not invade anyone and Ukraine did not attack. Why should we give up our territories and jeopardize population on these territories, sacrifice their lives for reaching any agreements? It's not about peace, it's about human lives, and we don't want peace on Russian terms. And when Western experts like Klarsfeld, who is very popular on Twitter now in France, he's a French speaker, they out of the blue start to promote these petitions for stopping, petitions to stop killing people in Donbass, or petitions to stop sending weapons. I just don't understand the motivation, if it's out of ideology or out of political views. But if he's on a payroll, I want to see more investigations from Western media on these people. I think we have to know and to label all those mouthpieces that spread Russian propaganda in the West, because they are dangerous. Like, they are dangerous not only for Ukraine, but they are dangerous for democracy in Europe and the West in general. They jeopardize democratic values. If they support murder, mass murders, genocide for the sake of peace, that's not a good tendency for the world either. That's why I think it's important to track them, like to monitor what they're saying, but also to call them out. And I mentioned Klarsfeld because his parents were fighting against Nazis. They were hunting for Nazi soldiers who committed war crimes, and it's a shame that he now speaks against Ukraine and supports Russia, even though he says he doesn't. But everything he says is like from a Russian handbook. And since he comes from this background of Nazi fighters, all French media, big French media, started to invite him to speak about it, like on their broadcasts. And I think it's really dangerous. They don't even invite any like counter view that would balance his opinion, or that would at least like say that it's all he says, that it's wrong and doesn't cause any good. Giving a platform to such people is very it's wild, I think. And I think Western activists who support Ukraine, and also any sane persons who want democracy to be in place, should call out these people and say to this media, look, this person is promoting genocide. You should not give him a platform to speak and endorse it publicly.
Yes, and of course, I mean, Italy has its fair deal of useful idiots and fifth columns, and of course, it's always, as you said, it's always very difficult to tell what the motivations are, in the sense that I'm sure there is a number of people who are, actively on the payroll, but very often they're probably a minority, and there are people who are just either there for ideological reasons, or they are just completely in bad faith, or people who simply don't have a real understanding of the subject, but just want to have, I don't know, whatever, it's a contrarian view or something like that. It's very difficult to understand how sometimes people who have never set foot in Ukraine, didn't know anything about Ukraine until a few months ago, don't speak Ukrainian, don't have friends in Ukraine, all of a sudden, a very specific views about what should happen to a specific region of Ukraine. It's very weird. It's very,
Yeah. Well, I think that the problem is also Russocentrism. I think in Italy it was the case when Russia was seen like as a great power, great country. Like there was this romanticization of the Soviet Union, and it remains in France, for example, or in other countries, maybe less, but there's this really romanticized view of Russia, and they used to perceive history and the reality through the Russian lens. And I think right now the challenge for Ukraine, and also for Western countries, is to shift this focus, like to give agency to Ukraine. Because our history was told to the world through the Russian imperial lens, and that's how they view us now. Like that's why these pro-Russian politicians, or just like normal citizens, that's why they believe everything that is said, because like Russia used to be the major voice for them, but not neighboring countries who were invaded and who suffered from its oppression. And I think that's a major problem, because if I see this narrative, when I see these narratives about like Donbass being Russian and Russians are oppressed in eastern southern Ukraine, like first thing I think about is that these people haven't read basic history. Because even if they read, I don't know, Wikipedia about Crimea or Donbass, they would see that these regions were Ukrainian. They would see that they voted for Ukraine to gain independence in the majority, and it's Russia who made them believe that they were oppressed, and it's Russia who populated ethnic Russians there while eliminating Ukrainian identity. And many of these people preserve their identity even though they speak Russian. but maybe it's too complex for people to understand. I don't know, but I think it's just basic history, and these people, like, according to their narratives, they don't know this basic history, or they just learn it from Arte or some Sputnik, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that you touch on something really important there, which is, of course, that the understanding of Ukraine, and to be honest, not only of Ukraine, but of most of Central and Eastern Europe, has in many Western European countries, has been always through a Russian/Soviet colonial imperialist lens, and there is very little awareness and very little knowledge of the history of that part of Europe, if not through that lens. And usually the people who would be interested in it would be people who would be interested in promoting that kind of narrative. And of course, I'm not talking about everyone. There are extraordinary academics and writers who have done incredible work on it, but at a widespread level, especially in countries like Italy, definitely. I can't speak of France because I don't know France enough, but definitely in Italy, that's quite common, and it's successful because it also, as you said, it picks up on a sentiment that is more shared among the population, and that's dangerous, of course.
But what's also funny is that many of these people say that's like they are pro-communist because they say that communism was for equal rights and things like this, and they are anti-colonial when they speak about Africa or Middle East, but they don't realize that Russia is a colonial power, that it colonized so many territories throughout centuries, and basically these people on these territories had no rights, like they didn't have the same rights as the rest. And like it's just like logic. It's not even, you don't even have to know history. Like why would you assume that Russia would give the same rights to people that it took by force, or other, like not only Ukrainians but other people? Why would it intervene into Chechnya, Georgia, or other countries? Like it's just like logical, critical thinking, and I think that a lot of people just lack it, blinded by ideology, just because
it's an ideological blind spot.
Far right. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you're right. It's an ideological blind spot.
No. I said everything already. I think
and
I might have a power outage at this point.
Okay,
I
but I was kind of coming to a close anyway.
If I drop out.
So since we're approaching 1 hour anyway, I think we can come to a close. And of course, I would like to thank you for coming here. I hope we'll have you as a guest in the future. There'll be more that you'll be able to tell us. What I wanted to do, of course, is to invite everyone to, if you're interested in more of Iryna's work, you can find her on Twitter. She has a very active and really insightful feed. And do support Ukrainian journalists. There are many ways to do so. You can donate to Kyiv Independent, of course, but and to other initiatives as well. I think Ukrainian journalists need and deserve all the support that we can give them, because as we mentioned earlier, they are the ones who are who are experiencing this war on a daily basis, and the whole, if we don't support Ukraine journalism, it's not just about reporting about the war, it's also about building a more democratic Ukraine. And if you don't support Ukrainian journalism, that can't happen either. So it's incredibly important to do so.
Thank you so much for inviting me and letting me speak about Ukraine to your audience. I don't have much reach out to Italians, but I'm happy to tell more about my experience and what is happening here on the ground. And I also encourage people to support any Ukrainian efforts to fight this invasion. Maybe like I'm not that active on Twitter anymore because I have a lot of work, and sometimes sometimes it's realistic to tweet anything. But I think I'll try to organize some kind of charity fundraise for the unit of my brother. If anyone is interested, you can follow me, because he's currently at the very front line, and he asked me to do some fundraising for him. So it's not something that a journalist is supposed to do, and we never asked for it, but that's the life we live in, and to survive all this, we need to fight, unfortunately, and that's why we have to do it. So if you're interested, please follow my page, and you can donate what you can or help in any way you can by sharing information or reading our works.
And by challenging all, the kind of views that we discussed earlier, it's something that everyone can do in their daily lives. Every time you meet a friend, a colleague, a relative who displays this view, just don't let that go unchallenged. Just question them. Just hold their feet to the fire until they change their mind. It's very important. It's something we have to do in our daily lives if we want to live in a free world. So yeah, and it's a very small effort compared to what every ordinary Ukrainian goes through every day. So everyone can do it.
Thank you so much for your support and attention to Ukraine.